Hi, everyone. My name is Marissa Petrou, and I'm director of the Guilbeau Center for Public History at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Today, I'm going to talk about a podcast series that I worked on with my students. The series is called Healing in the Bayou. But before I begin my presentation, I would first like to express my gratitude to the elders, past, present, and future of the Chitimacha, Coushatta, Gina Choctaw, Mississippi Band of Choctaw, Tunica Biloxi, Appaloosa, and the Attakapas Ishak, for stewarding this land on which I work and live. I also honor the peoples of African descent who worked this land as enslaved laborers when it was the Mouton sugar plantation of El Copal, land which would become the city of Lafayette. This presentation discusses a podcast series that was produced by public history students and the Guilbeau Center for Public History in collaboration with the Iberia African American Historical Society and Youngsville Historical Preservation Society. The podcast series was a product of the graduate seminar, Oral History of Folk Medicine, which sought to incorporate traditional and Indigenous knowledge systems as part of a critical analysis of the history of mainstream medicine and academic history methodologies. This project offers the opportunity to consider how to work with podcasts to train students in oral histories, digital history, public engagement, community collaboration, decolonizing methodologies, and supporting healing relationships between the academy and marginalized communities. I want to apologize. I've not put together a slideshow for this presentation. I think it's the first conference presentation I've ever done where I've not put together a slideshow, but it's also 2021 and my eyes are just like, we need a break from screen time. So that was the decision behind that. Okay, back to the show. So I first want to explain that we initially had planned for this project to work with the Coushatta tribe of Louisiana. And this was part of the Guilbeau Center's project to build stronger ties between the university and the tribal nations of the region. We already had a good working relationship with the Coushatta tribe, and therefore that's who I reached out to when I was thinking about this project. However, the students and the Guilbeau Center's position as outsiders meant that we were not eligible to engage with Kwasati knowledge pertaining to medicine or healing. I had first reached out to Dr. Linda Langley, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, regarding land acknowledgement for the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And then knowing that the tribe was interested in documenting its own history, I thought that this might be a good project. But the tribe's response was no, because this knowledge is considered closed knowledge, passed between family members and only selectively at particular moments. However, I would like to emphasize, as the Coushatta tribe's archivist, Mariana Luquette Piazza, mentioned to me today, our relationship with the tribe remains strong and we continue to work with them on many other projects. And that this particular instance is an important lesson of understanding boundaries and what knowledge one should be privy to or not based on their relationship with the tribe. Okay, so given this shift, we expanded the project, but continue to be informed by Indigenous scholarship, combining oral history, archival research, and recent scholarship in the history of medicine, Indigenous studies, and public history. Students examined the history of healing practices among the African American, Acadian, Creole, and Indigenous communities in Southwest Louisiana. The podcast episodes discuss topics in women's reproductive health, Creole, Cajun, Mexican, and Mexican American traditional faith healing, healthcare access in the Jim Crow South, and the concept of community health and wellness. By collaborating with Iberia African American Historical Society, and Youngsville Historical Preservation Society, we could also support their respective efforts to build their own oral history collections. So, the Healing in the Bayou podcast series developed out of a graduate public history class that actually had several working titles, including Oral Histories of Folk Medicine, Public History of Healing, Decolonizing Public History, and Race, Gender, and Colonialism in the History of Medicine. The course was divided into 3 parts, and the first part examined history of medicine literature with a focus on race, gender, and colonialism in North America. In the second part, we developed a framework drawing on oral history and Indigenous studies literature to conduct oral histories with 2 different South Louisiana communities, each with their own relationships to the rise of modern medicine and their own interest in collecting these histories. In part 3, over the course of a month, students carried out 4 to 5 oral histories with members of the Iberia African American Historical Society and Youngsville Historical Society. And then they produce a podcast from everything they had collected. So for a bit of an overview of some of the key texts that were really inspirational for the podcast, we looked at Kim Anderson's Life Stages and Native Women, Memory, Teaching, and Story Medicine, which taught us that for Métis, Cree, and Anishinaabe women, remembering and relating stories of the past is a healing process. Alice Miko Snow and Susan Stan's Healing Plants, Medicine of the Seminole Indians provided an example of decolonizing medicine through sharing knowledge about plants and ancestral Seminole practices for their use in healing. Amy Lonetree and John Danka's special issue of the Public Historian, Conversations in Critical Cultural Heritage, especially Sonya Atalay's article, Braiding Strands of Wellness, provided a guide for braiding together different knowledge systems, including Western and Indigenous, university and community, and intellectual and physical, emotional, and spiritual forms of knowledge. Chip Caldwell's article in the same issue, Can Repatriation Heal the Wounds of History?, drew our attention to the limits to healing provided through repatriation. Teresa Barnett and John Noriega's Oral History and Communities of Color reminded us that oral history, while expanding our definition of sources and archives, has focused on white communities, and that this is evident within particular methods of oral history approaches taken and guidelines circulated, which marginalize ways of communicating by communities of color. All of these writings provided methodological models and theoretical lenses for how to collaborate with communities either part of or marginalized by the mainstream medical profession, whether based on race, ethnicity, culture, or belief system. In addition, students listened to numerous history podcasts for inspiration and read Hannah Hethman's So Your Museum Needs a Podcast. You probably recognize Hethman as host of Museums in Strange Places. By the time we began our work in August 2019, there were over 500 million podcasts available worldwide. My students all agreed with Hethman's assessment that the podcast is an intimate medium and podcasters are trusted to entertain and to keep their listeners company. These attributes were what my students liked about podcasts and hoped to create in their own. In a podcast training workshop, students learned how to use equipment in the Guilbeau Center for Public History's podcast studio. You can check out what we have by looking at guilbeaucenter.com. So now for a look at what the students produced. For my remaining time, I'm going to provide a brief overview of several, but not all, of the episodes in the podcast. So you can take a look at what really inspired students from the literature that they read and what histories were uncovered through their oral history interviews. In her episode, Alternative Approaches to Pregnancy, Annabelle Smith explains that this podcast series aims to provide a sort of healing in itself, as throughout her studies on healing and medicinal practices, it has been shown that communication with others has a positive effect on healing and reclamation of identity. Focusing on South Louisiana, each episode of this series includes interviews with community members to learn about different experiences with mainstream medicine or alternative healing practices, including midwives, traiteurs, and traditional Indigenous healers. The creation of the podcast series was itself an exercise in how to conceive of the process of scholarship as a process of healing, registering the voices of students who feel marginalized in academic and public history. In Annabelle Smith's episode, which focuses on alternative approaches to pregnancy, she engages with Stephen Kahn's and Chip Caldwell's respective discussions of the history of healing and therapy in the US and how this history might relate to NAGPRA. In Do Museums Still Need Objects?, Stephen Kahn argues that therapy only speaks to the single individual's needs instead of collective achievable goals. In Can Repatriation Heal the Wounds of History?, Chip Caldwell points out that this definition of therapy ignores the long history of collective suffering exacted by colonialism. While Annabelle's focus is not on repatriation, she does investigate just what constitutes healing and therapy for non-Indigenous Americans and provides further evidence of Stephen Kahn's narrow understanding of healing and the context in which it may take place. For Smith, decolonizing involves centering women's voices, women's bodies, and experiences, and decentering mainstream professional medicine and mainstream knowledge systems more broadly. Smith's episode investigates renewed interest in alternative medicine and childbirth and argues that this is a result of the increased stressors associated with modern life. But her interviews with Black elders, Beulah Pearl Provo, and Eddie Christian reveal that skepticism in the Black community is due to a wide range of sources and not always directed at the entirety of modern medicine. Ms. Beulah discussed her family members' hesitance to be treated at a Lafayette charity hospital post-segregation, believing that private hospitals, which required you to pay, would provide better medicine. Eddie Christian added that although he had been born by a Black doctor in Iberia Parish in 1940, which was very unusual among his friends who had mostly been birthed by midwives, he also pointed out that by 1945, or specifically in 1945, all of the Black doctors of Iberia Parish were violently expelled by local police. In Cassie McAllister's episode titled Marginalized Communities, we further learn about the African American experience with medicine during segregation in Louisiana. We learn from Harold Hayes, for example, that African Americans in Iberia Parish were refused treatment at their local hospitals and had to travel to neighboring Lafayette or New Orleans for treatment at the charity hospital. Mr. Hayes' experience emphasizes how medical access was tied to race and financial resources and to geography. For this episode, Cassie drew inspiration from Keith Waylu's Dying in the City of the Blues, Sickle Cell Anemia and the Politics of Race and Health, as well as Richard McKay's Patient Zero and the Making of the AIDS Epidemic, and Alice Miko Snow and Susan Stan's Healing Plants, Medicine of the Florida Seminole Indians. The Jim Crow South and the AIDS epidemic provide two historical moments for Cassie to explore how marginalized communities turn to alternative medicinal practices to make up for inadequate professional care or the limits of mainstream medicine. In Ian Gregory Graff's episode titled Community Health, We learn he was heavily inspired by Kim Anderson's life stages and Native women, memory, teachings, and story medicine. Ian explains that Dr. Anderson's book compiled oral histories with members of different Indigenous community groups, which helped him to understand the role that these practices play within their communities, and also inspired him to look at traditions and understandings regarding community health among other Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups. For Ian, decolonizing constituted a discussion of traditional medicinal practices across a variety of ethnic communities, including naturopathic physician Dr. Nicole Redvers of the Deninu First Nation in Canada's Northwest Territories, with Adam Chasson, who is of Chitimacha descent, and Black Elder John Dominique of Iberia Parish. Building on Dr. Anderson's attention to healing as a collective experience, Ian focuses on family conceptions of wellness and the passing down of knowledge related to wellness among family members. So for the last few minutes, I want to just look at the next seasons of Healing in the Bayou. So when I first applied to present at this conference during the summer of 2020, we were 5 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, 2 months into the mainstream recognition of racism as a second pandemic, and still several months away from the American Medical Association making a statement that racism was a public health threat. So when I applied to present this particular project at this conference, I was excited for the opportunity to organize my thoughts and the work I had accomplished with my students in fall 2019. This work took on additional significance during the age of COVID and the current reckoning with whiteness now taking place in Southwest Louisiana and globally. I developed a new project over the past summer called Shared Histories, documenting COVID-19 and the movement for Black lives in Southwest Louisiana, and chose to extend the Healing in the Bayou podcast for at least another 2 seasons. This time exploring the experiences of and responses to the intersection of the COVID-19 pandemic and structural inequality by people of this region. I designed a similar assignment for undergraduate and graduate students to conduct multiple oral histories and then edit them into a podcast episode. For both classes, I emphasized Kim Anderson's lesson that the process of doing oral history work is as important as the product. What I found last semester is that students absolutely loved this project, even when I gave them much less time, and they absolutely found the oral history work itself healing, getting to speak about tough conversations with different members of their community, creating a space for dialogue between community members of different ethnic and class backgrounds who may not otherwise open up about difficult topics such as everyday racism or socioeconomic disparities during the current health crises. The oral histories were not just experiences of storytelling. Like all good oral histories, they were also about listening. Students then created podcast episodes focusing on a specific theme that they noticed across the interviews that they conducted. Students reported in the end that not only did these constitute their favorite assignment, they confirmed that they opened up relationships or built stronger connections, even between longtime friends or relatives. So with that, I encourage you to consider conducting oral histories, using the books that I've listed, the importance of Indigenous studies for expanding, decolonizing what our concept is of an oral history and of a podcast. Good luck and stay safe.